already mentioned that we import, so we expect that we are going to have price hikes. For example, many rice-producing countries are no longer exporting rice, so it is going to, prices will increase at some point. We also import a lot of wheat. We know that we are going to face some price hikes there. This is the crucial point. Even where you have price increases, you need a watchdog to check whether the extent of the price increase is justified by the cost that the supplier is facing. So this is also an assurance that we want to give, that we have our experts on the ground, our economists, following what the cost increases are and whether whatever price increases we face are justified by such costs. There are, in this respect, suppliers that we have taken to the tribunal for prosecution because we have, the lockdown started, we've had more than 1,500 cases. This is just the Competition Commission. Of course, our counterparts in the National Consumer Commission also have their numbers. Out of these cases, we've already prosecuted and leveled fines of about 13 million. Of course, some of these have now been redirected as donations to the Solidarity Fund. We also have outstanding cases where we are awaiting judgments. Some of you may have seen in the public domain, for example, that a large supplier of masks, Dis-Chem, has been under prosecution at the tribunal. That case is complete. We are done with it. We are waiting for a judgment. And there are many others. We have over 30 firms that are at various stages of concluding settlements agreement with an admission that they increased prices unfairly. So that, all of that is work in progress. But in concluding, ministers, I wish to say that without declaring victory on prices, that I think the work that was done earlier on by either government and regulatory authorities, making calls and warning suppliers about the laws and making the right regulations have yielded some positive results, in the sense that although we have a few who are still engaged in opportunistic behavior, but by and large, I think prices are under control. Of course, doesn't mean that we must not be careful. We must continue monitoring them very, very closely. Thank you very much, Minister Mthembu, for the time. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, colleagues. We have now reached the stage where we will take questions directed to my colleagues on the inputs that they have made from this podium. Without any further ado, is there any person on the online services?
Thank you, Minister. We don't have callers at the moment.
Thank you. Nangaba, do you have any people asking questions from your WhatsApp services?
Yes, Minister, we do.
As usual. Okay, let's start, Nangaba.
The first question is from John Fraser from ZA Confidential. It's directed to Dan Cronje from FIN24. And the question is, Minister, who is responsible for procuring COVID-19 tests that mines use? And with the backlog of thousands of tests, how long are mines waiting to receive the results for their testing?
Minister Delil, can you hear Nangaba there?
I can hear.
Not me, the questions.
Yes, I can hear the questions, Minister. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you very much. Can continue, Nangal.
A related question from Alan from Business Day, also directed to Minister Mantashe. With a backlog of nearly 100,000 unprocessed COVID-19 tests, how do you suggest the mining industry increase testing, and how does a collaborative approach you suggested help? And is there a percentage of infection where the department will order the shutdown of mines, and what is the shutdown trigger? Then the last question that we have so far is from Vikas Berger from Nagver Furindwandach. It's directed to Minister Patel. Can you please clarify and provide detail on regulations under Level 3 regarding domestic workers, including gardeners? Also, should domestic workers, including gardeners...
Can we direct that question to the right minister?
Okay.
Okay. Okay, continue.
Okay. Should domestic workers, including gardeners, be transported privately by their employers, or can they, domestic workers or gardeners, also make use of public transport to travel to their workplaces? What safety measures should be put in place by the employer? I assume the question was actually directed to the Minister of Labour.
It will be.
Yes.
The other part that talks to transport, the Minister of Transport is coming tomorrow. But having said that, can we start with Minister Mantashe?
Oh.
You use that one. The one that you have in front of you. Yes, there we are.
Oh, this one is Sevens.
Yes.
Okay. Who procures test kits for the mines? It is the mining companies. They procure the test kits. Actually, when we did our unpronounced visits to the mines, we discovered that many of the mines were complaining of incapacity or shortage of test kits. We advised them to pool their resources together and establish regional centers for testing. That's why if you go to Carltonville, you're going to see the old Leslie William Hospital, which is now a private hospital, being used by all the mines in the area. If you go to Rustenburg, you'll see 2 hospitals used by all the mines. So it goes on and on in all the regions. The pooling of resources make it less expensive on the individual mines. So who procures test kits is the mines through the centers that they fund. Unprocessed tests, there's a backlog of unprocessed tests in the mines, because you remember that when we insisted on bringing mine workers to the mines where they can be tested, there was a lot of resistance to that. But we insisted that, listen, if mine workers don't come back, you're not going to test them. And the problem is that when they come back in big numbers, you're going to have a spiral in every mining area. Now, the systematic phase-in of bringing back mine workers gave us capacity to test them. That's why we're not shocked by the result of testing. Now, what is the trigger for shutdown of a mine? There are many triggers. Let me give you an example. We went to a mine in Tubatsi Valley called Dwats Refir. When we came there, we found one case that tested positive, and we visited that mine physically. We discovered that they were not screening and testing. We used Section 54 and closed that operation and said, you will test, you will screen. And that's where we discovered 31 cases in one set of tests. We had closed that operation, it's not open yet. The second one is an example of Mponeng in Carltonville. On the basis of the numbers, the company agreed with us that, listen, we're voluntarily closing this operation until we know the extent of the problem. So there will be many triggers that lead to a closure of a mine. But the reality of the matter is that we don't want mines to fear closure and therefore avoid testing and hide cases. We want mines to test and appreciate that we're going to work together in confronting a challenge that is facing the mining industry. It is not the primary intention to close operation. The primary objective is to detect the extent of infections in the mine so that we know what size of a problem are we dealing with. Because when we know, we're better off than when we do not know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Minister, I say you can use that one.
Oh, no, yes.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. No, the issue of transport for the workers was meant for the large employers, and also in particular, one example is mining, and because some of them will have to readapt the workplaces, they have to introduce the shifts and so on, and some of the people might knock off very, very late when e-transport is no more available. So we were talking about those, but when we're referring to the gardeners and the domestic workers, we expect that they will be using the public transport, but that's why there are certain protocols which are expected from the public transport as issued out by Minister Mbalula, including the issue of social distancing and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Minister Patel.
Thank you very much. I think the only question was from John Fraser on the export of PPE to the rest of the continent. John, in fact, you've pointed to a significant opportunity, and we've already begun to supply and export PPE to neighboring countries and to the rest of the continent. With the global shortage of personal protective equipment, many countries on the continent look to South Africa to assist in making kit available to fight the virus. And it's important that we do so because as neighbors, it's only when we can ensure that the infection does not spread across the region that South Africans are safe. But there's also, of course, social solidarity that we need to show to neighboring countries. And very importantly, in the long run, there are economic opportunities also. The lesson of the pandemic is that Africa as a continent must make sure that we have the required capabilities and capacity to produce, that we must never again be subject to the shortages we've seen globally that places the lives of our people at risk. So in this period, on hand sanitizer, which of course is a critical first-line defense, we have now exported 150 million liters of sanitizer to countries elsewhere in the continent. Most of it is to immediate neighbors, but some of our sanitizer, hand sanitizer, has also gone to Ghana, to Kenya, to Nigeria, and to Uganda. On face masks, millions of face masks have now been produced and made available for healthcare workers in neighboring countries and elsewhere. Their governments have placed orders with South African factories, and these have been produced. The biggest one has been the sale of masks to Botswana, followed by Namibia and, of course, Zambia, Lesotho, and Eswatini. I want to indicate, though, that with masks, we've also been able to export masks to countries like Nigeria and Egypt and Algeria, Gabon and Kenya. These are all examples of South African manufacturers already taking on the responsibility to produce so that we as a continent, there's another issue which is medication, general medication. Of course, much of during the time when people are affected by COVID, they'll need a range of general medication. But also, in addition to that, even those who are not infected still have medical needs. People are diabetic, they've got asthma, they have cancer. And South Africa has been a significant producer of general medication, antibiotics, antiviral, Southern African Development Community, so that's our immediate neighbors, and much of the rest has been sold on the rest of the African continent. So it underlines what you've indicated. It shows that it's not only a future opportunity, but it's also currently something that we are doing. And we've encouraged manufacturers to ramp up and to think of the whole African market. We will soon be implementing the African Continental Free Trade Area. It was due to start, of course, on the 1st of July, but because of COVID, it will be postponed. And a formal date will be announced as soon as we have agreement by all countries that are affected by the free trade agreement. And that's the moment when companies, manufacturers will be producing for a wider market. Thank you.
Having said that, now I don't want to be arrested by Minister Bheki Cele. Can you shift to this side? Because I need to adhere to social distancing. So, much better. Thank you, colleagues. Do we have anything on the online services?
Thank you, Minister. We have one caller on the line, Thabo Makutwane from Rainbow FM. Over to you, Thabo.
Thank you, Ministers. Good afternoon. My first question goes to Minister Nxesi. Minister, you mentioned notices. You mentioned something about notices issued to non-compliant businesses. From prohibition to improvement notices, could you please explain what exactly do these notices mean? And my second question is to Minister Patel. You made mention of the word toolbox. I know at level 4 we were already seeing closures in the retail and healthcare sectors due to infections. So this means the country should somehow expect a rise in infections as we move to level 3. So I just wanted to know what measures have you put in place to deal with the spike, or are we going to see a retent, particularly for certain industries, if we see a spike in infections? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, Minister. We also have another caller, Vuyo Mvogo from ENCA.
Vuyo, the usual suspect.
To the Minister of Labour and Employment, I just wanted to check if there will be any special dispensation for schools, because they may not be able to appoint compliance officers and the like. I mean, a school typically has teachers, pupils, a small number of people. That may include a secretary, a gardener or a caretaker. So, and this is where there's probably going to be a high need. What is going to happen there? Is there a special dispensation for schools? And then another question to you as well, Minister, is whether companies that say applied to the UIF in April and they were successful, but they still haven't received the money, but have to pay the workers end of this month, only that they were going to get the money. Will they still get the May money, or will you start, let's say, in June? If you can just clarify. And just lastly, to Minister Mantashe, just your assessment of what could be responsible for the spike in positive cases in the mining industry. Thanks.
Thank you, Vuyo.
The last caller, Minister Bonga Dulani from EWA. Over to you, Bonga.
Another usual suspect.
Hello, Minister. Thank you. Minister Nxesi, when you say that employees have the right not to work if employers don't employ safety measures when dealing with COVID, going back to work next week, what kind of sections do you look at also if maybe you have usual suspects when it comes to not following safety protocols at workplaces? Can you recommend, or are you looking at the government? Thank you.
Can you repeat that? What kind of what, Bonga?
what kind of sanctions
Sanctions.
is the department looking at
Yeah.
usual suspects?
Sesiyasizwa isilungu sakho manje ba.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
thanks.
Can we have taken 3. Let's take maybe another 3 from your side then. Nanga.
Okay. Another question from Jan Cronje from Fin24. It's related to Bonga's question. It's to Minister Nxesi. If an employee has reasonable belief that their employer has not put in place required precautions against the spread of COVID-19, what specific steps can that employee take? The next question is from Carol Payton from Business Day. It's also for Minister Nxesi. Can you elaborate on the regulation that colleagues in close contact with infected individuals must be quarantined for 14 days? How do you determine what close contact is? And secondly, does this restriction apply to health workers? And on the requirement to close workplaces where infections have occurred, what exactly are the regulations, and do these also apply to health facilities? And then the third one is from Kyle Cohen from News 24. It's directed to Minister Patel. Could you please provide an update on the National Ventilator Project? Has a final design been decided? And what progress has been made in terms of starting production? When will the National Ventilator Project start production? And how many ventilators are expected to be completed on what timeline? Then we have a ventilators are concerned. Thank you.
Do you have a question, Minister Mantashe?
One.
Take it.
Should I take it?
Yes.
There is only one question as to what is responsible for the spike in the mining industry. There are 2 reasons for that. The first one is that during the lockdown there was no testing happening in the mines. Now there's testing. That is one reason for that. And when we said allow mine workers to return so that they can be tested, we predicted the spike. And the second one is that because screening and testing is done before people go to work, we're having a better chance to detect the extent of the problem before people go to work. Because once there is an accident of one person escaping and go underground and test positive, the likelihood is that that entire crew is likely to be infected and will be forced to quarantine the entire crew. If they went down with the cage, everybody who was in that cage is a contact. That person will have to be traced and be tested. And every time we do that, there will be a spike in that particular mine. And that is an important development, that mine workers must be tested. The extent of the problem must not be hidden so that we can confront it.
Thank you, Minister. Minister Nxesi.
Let me just first add on the question about the gardeners and domestic workers and say that every employer has a responsibility to provide protective clothing. Every employer, including the employers of the domestic workers. So, which therefore says the issue of the sanitizers, all that protective equipment which might be needed, the masks, it's a must even for the domestic workers and gardeners. Let me leave there. A number of questions which have been asked. Vuyo, any special dispensation for schools? Because schools are dealing with children, I know there are discussions between the education department and the public works about some extra staff members who have to be put in there in order to give support in relation to issues of screening and so on. There are protocols which have been debated or put by or proposed by the Ministry of Education. So that's what has happened there. So there will be people who will be helping in the schools. They cannot be exonerated. All of us, we have to put various protocols. But I think the Ministry of Education can be able to explain that what are those protocols, and that discussion with Public Works to make available some of the EPWP workers to help in the schools. And the other question from, I think it's Jan Cronje from Fin24, if an employee has a reasonable belief their employer has not put in place required precautions against the spread of the virus, what specific steps do you expect the employee to take? We are going to rely, one, on the organized workers, the unions. The shop stewards are very, very important here to be able to help us, because we can't be in every workplace. Even if we had wanted to, we can't be there. Secondly, we've requested that there must be health and safety committees which are put in place. And those health and safety committees must have worker representatives. That's what we are saying. There is no worker who just agree that just go and kill yourself, because that's what it means. If people are forcing the workers to do that, it means if they are not doing that, workers can immediately declare disputes, and they can report to us that here are the people who are violating, and we will be able to deal with those disputes through our structures and so on. But if it becomes better if they have the organized formations at the workplace. I think there's a question from Carol to elaborate on the regulation that colleagues in close contact with the infected individuals must be quarantined for 14 days. How do you determine what close contact is? Does this restriction apply to the health workers? And yes, it applies to all the workers. It applies to all the workers. And how do you describe close contact? I'm not sure how medical people describe it, but what we know is that if there is one person who has been infected, you will have to check all the workers who have been working with that particular person in that particular workplace. That's what we know, or in that particular unit. So that's how we interpret it. And also on the requirement to close the workplaces where infections have occurred, what exactly are the regulations, and do they apply to health facilities? I've said they apply to all. They apply to all. We had a situation in the Eastern Cape where a hospital, Frere Hospital, was given a prohibition notice to say they must close because they had not done 1, 2, 3. The different sanctions which we give the different sanctions. A prohibition is when there's total neglect, and you can see that the workers are in danger. We have not put any of what we have recommended must be put. And remember, this is not just about even COVID-19. Some of these recommendations we're putting are coming from Occupational Health and Safety Act. They have long been there. So we give those prohibition notices if people do not comply 100%, or even we say more than 50% they have not complied. But some of them, we're able to give notices. We say we're giving you 7 days that you quickly deal with these issues, and we are going to come back. And some of them you might find that they've not been able to do 1 or 2 things out of 10 things which they are supposed to do. We are also warning them to quickly deal with those issues. We give them a day or 2. What else? I might be leaving something else. I will come back to it but those are the issues which I've been able to capture. Maybe let me also deal with this issue of the hospitals. There's a big debate about the public hospitals in particular. If the regulations are not followed, the protective measures have not been followed, are you able to quickly close the hospital like that? And juxtapose that to the public interest. The hospital might be having 1,000 what you call patients. Are you able to close that? Where do you take those patients to? So clearly the weight of the public interest tends to behavior. Hence we have to quickly intervene and say, try and deal with these issues overnight, so that we don't sit with the issue of saying we are evacuating the patients and so on. But everybody is expected to comply, even if it means people have to work overnight to be able to put those things. But some of the things are simple issues of having people testing or screening the people when they get in, of putting the sanitizers and so on. Those are easy things to do. It's not about major constructions which you have to do. And we urge the public employers also to comply.
Thank you. Maybe also Minister Dilil, you can come in with regard to your role. I saw that in your statement you did mention your role assisting the Department of Education as it relates to screening in schools. Would you like to say a word or two, Minister?
Yes, thank you, Minister Mthembu. I can confirm that we are in discussion with the Department of Education to recruit at least between 4 and 5 people per school that can help with the cleaning, and security. We're looking at a total of 150,000 EPWP workers for a period of 6 months, while we then start a process to employ permanent workers with all the schools, because it must become a permanent feature at all our schools in post-COVID-19. We have employed 23,000 CWP workers for the Department of Health to assist with the screening, and they were trained by the Department of Health, and the Department of Health will continue to monitor them and apply for more help if and when it's needed. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Minister Dilil. Minister Patel.
Thank you, colleague. 3 questions have been put to me. The first one is from Rainbow FM on what is the purpose of the toolbox that I spoke of. And I think Minister Ngesi has already covered some of this. I want to really just build a bit on what was a fairly detailed reply that is given. When we open the economy for a greater number of workers to return to work, it means more movement of people. And that does mean greater opportunities for the virus to spread. And the danger here is that a poorly executed return to work could lead to a sudden spike which can overwhelm our healthcare system. To avoid that, what we have been saying is we've used one blunt weapon in the past, which is in the toolbox. So the first thing in the toolbox is that we've issued directions. In other words, in the Government Gazette, we have provided details of what every workplace should do. The distance between workers, the sanitizing arrangements, the clocking in, the canteens, those are provided for there. So that's one critical set of instruments in the directions. But the second thing we've done is we've sat down with industries, a number of industries, employing more than 3 million workers, and they've all taken those directions and see where can they go even further. Where can they reinforce those measures? Where can they deal with challenges that are not fully set out in the directions? I'll give an example that if we have no change in the start of working time at factories and large businesses, we will continue to have enormous strains on the public transport system. So in many of these cases, companies have looked at staggered starting times, so that instead of all the pressure being at one moment, we flatten the curve during the day of when transport is needed. And then we've also had business federations issuing guidelines to the members, and trade unions are also working now to see what are safe measures. So out of those initiatives, we'll have a number of tools in the toolbox. The question is, are these tools being used? Because you could have a toolbox filled with tools but not use them. And so to do that, there's a number of measures we've put in place. First, the regulations provide that every workplace must have a COVID compliance officer. One person who is nominated officially, that person has the legal responsibility to ensure that these measures are put in place and is accountable if asked why there has been a lapse. That person has to then respond to that. So we hope that the COVID compliance officers will have everybody's support, because they are an important instrument, an important means of ensuring that the measures are adhered to. Secondly, we've asked businesses to commit that all of their managers will be responsible for safer working places. This must be an all-in effort. Third, and this is where Minister Ngesi and his team has been leading our thinking and our work, it's to use those inspectors that the Department of Employment and Labour has, inspectors that other government departments have, at not only at national level but even at provincial or local level. And of course, there are innovations. The other day, one of the trade unions have mentioned that we should even get bargaining council agents to be trained to look at compliance. Finally, and very importantly, it's shop stewards. South Africa has tens of thousands of shop stewards in different sectors. And these are workplace representatives chosen by the workers. In the past, shop stewards have looked principally at things like wages, working hours, unfair dismissal. We're asking the union movement, we met with them, we're asking them, shift the focus of shop stewards to saving lives, to ensuring that the COVID measures are introduced, that the toolbox is used at every workplace, and work with the managers, but also report to government if there are breaches that cannot be resolved at the workplace, so that we can come in and make sure that we don't have people's lives being put at risk unnecessarily. The next area that was asked was Cal Cohen from News 24 asked some questions about the National Ventilator Project. So let me just recall, I showed Cal earlier an example, a prototype of one of the ventilators. We launched this project in April. So in February we saw the rising infections. In March, when the President addressed the nation and said we're going to go into lockdown, we immediately put feelers out to see where could we buy ventilators globally, because we were not making them in South Africa. And we found that the global market was absolutely depleted, that as soon as ventilators are made, they are snapped up, and the prices were rising. We then put a call to South African innovators to come forward. And in April, that call was formalized publicly through a request for proposals, saying anyone who's got a viable idea how we can build ventilators here, please do so. And we had a really strong outpouring of support. Some car manufacturers, the people who make the components for cars, put up their hand and said, we can do something. Appliance manufacturers who do the kind of normal appliances used in the kitchen said, we can repurpose our technologies. And innovators in some science councils and others all came forward with ideas and suggestions. So we said, let all those ideas come forward, and the purpose of this is to narrow down to 3 final companies. These 3 final companies would then be appointed and they would commence production. So production will now start in June, and the questions we ask with ventilators are they fit for purpose? In other words, do they allow the basic function of getting oxygen into the lungs? We ask the question, are they safe? These are people's health that are being addressed, and so it's important that they meet the safety standards, and that's we have the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority that also looks at these kind of things. Then we look, are they flexible? Can they be used outside of a major, well-equipped hospital? Can they also be used in field hospitals in rural areas where we don't have all the facilities that we need? And then finally, are they affordable? Can we have a bit of competition between players to see can we get a pressure that the prices must not be too high? And so that's been what the effort has been to date. On the numbers, production will start in June. Of course, with these things, one can't predict with absolute precision because they're new technologies, they're new businesses in some cases, where one company that has not done this before is repurposing and sort it out, take it through a regulatory process, start the production and so on. We're seeking to reduce that to 3 months. And in doing so, July will be a full-on production month if all goes well according to the schedules. And by August, we hope to achieve at least 20,000 units that would have been produced. Of course, if there are glitches and challenges, some of these numbers may be affected. But we have companies that are very confident. They're saying to us they're rearing to go. We've just got to make sure that all the necessary legal loops are crossed, because in the healthcare sector, unlike the making of widgets for a microphone, there are requirements to ensure that people are safe. Amanda then asked the question, well, if they are produced, will we have a special dispensation by Treasury for the procurement or the purchasing of this? We've worked both with Treasury, but we've also worked very actively with the Solidarity Fund. Members of the media, South Africans, will recall the President announced the formation of the fund. It's a fund that brings together people from business, from labor, from society at large. It has the backing of government, and it has raised a significant sum of money already from individual contributions and monies firms have put in. Many South Africans have agreed that a portion of their wages go there. Some have made a contribution at supermarkets or crowdfunding. And that money has been used to buy masks and do all sorts of things to support the fight against COVID-19. The Solidarity Fund has already made available a small sum of money. We call it seed funding to get as far as we have. And they're looking at a proposal now together with a consortium of other funders to make a purchase order of the order of 20,000 units. And if we're successful with that, we still continue talking to National Treasury to get additional units purchased. And of course, as more units run off the production line, coming back to the earlier question that was put to us, we hope we can also export some of that. So the first focus now is to make sure that we meet the basic demand of the domestic market and of neighboring countries, and then hopefully build viable and strong businesses that can stay in business even in the long term. Because these CPAP machines that we're talking about are used for a range of respiratory illnesses, not only COVID-19, but obviously the demand for them, the units required, are enormous in this period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. That concludes the questions that we have had up to now. Do we still have some on the online platform?
Yes, thank you, Minister. We have 2 callers. The first one is Mercedes Besant from SABC and Mushengu from Sunday Times. Over to you, Mercedes.
Yes. Good afternoon. Minister Thulas Nesi, we are inundated with calls or complaints, especially within the retail sector, where some workers say they are told if you self-isolate for that 14 days, you won't get paid. So some of the workers, they then just go back to work and because they are afraid that they won't get paid. And while they are still awaiting their results, and later some of them, they might return positive. So what must happen? That's the first one. And then you are saying, Minister, that unions must come on board and shop stewards because you won't be able to do it alone as a department. Now, you know that other workers are not organized, in the workplaces, and they are not being allowed and they are intimidated. But other workers, they are saying when they want to report some of this non-compliance and when they are forced to work, despite the COVID case in the workplace, they can't get through to register their complaints with inspectors. So that is also the other situation. What must happen in this regard? And a last question, I've heard Minister Patel speaking about the COVID compliance officers. I want to know how must they be on site or do they also work virtually? Because I just heard today from one person in an institution that they only know the compliance officer, but they've never seen him or even in the building.
Okay. Next caller.
Good afternoon, Minister. Thank you very much. My first question is to Minister Delil around the quarantine facilities. I think she mentioned 1,751. Of those, 642 are state-sponsored. And then there's 129,600 beds. My question, therefore, is of the state-sponsored quarantine facilities, how much was spent in total? And of the beds and the quarantine facilities in total, how many are occupied up to this stage and how many are not occupied? Same question on occupation on the beds. And then secondly, on the beds, I think the minister didn't give us the division as to the ones for the state and the ones that are private. And on the private ones, does it mean that the private ones, people who are quarantined there, will have to pay? Secondly, to Minister Mantashe, Minister Mantashe gave us the numbers of the test, 4,600 and positive 384. How many mine workers have been at work under level 4 and how many are expected under level 3 in total? Thank you very much.
Can we hear from you, Nanga?
We have a follow-up from Vuyo Mvoko to Minister Mantashe, and he's asking, with hindsight, did mining not open too soon and too aggressively? And he's also asking that, but were not given their money, will they be paid in May? Because some of those employers may have borrowed money to pay employers. Then we have another question from Sidwell from the Mail newspaper. It's also directed to Minister Nesi. Earlier this month, the Department of Employment and Labour announced new regulations that would allow employees to directly apply to the UIF for special coronavirus benefits, but you didn't say how workers can directly request money from the UIF. Can you please explain how workers can directly claim COVID-19 money from the UIF? Nelly from Netwerk is asking Minister Patel, in the regulations for level 3 that were released yesterday, there is a reference to additional restrictions that may apply in hotspots. I would like to know if liquor sales will be allowed in hotspot areas, and is there any discussions to ban liquor sales in hotspot areas? And a related question to that is, the regulations also refer to the sale of liquor may be subjected to certain directions. When will those directions be released, and could you please elaborate on what those directions will contain? Carol Payton to Minister Nesi. It seems that particularly in the Western Cape, there have been numerous labour disputes over whether employers have taken all necessary steps for health and safety. Are there agreements in place that can be used as a reference? Nazir from Glow TV is asking Minister Patel, I understand that you are dealing with businesses who are inflating prices, but how are you curbing the inflating of prices by private individuals who may not normally, who are not normally in this business, but are exploiting the situation and are importing containers of COVID-19 related goods? One can only go on social media to see how consumers are being exploited. And then a follow-up from Nazir.
How many have you put to us now?
Note that you said yesterday that you are busy engaging with hair salon groups concerning reopening. Just to say that given that many learners and teachers may be going back to school on Monday, grooming and neatness is vital. Thus, haircuts are desperately needed. Hopefully, you will reach an amicable solution soon.
It's a comment. Who starts? I've started with Mr. Mantashe.
I have two questions, Minister. How many workers are at work in alert level 4, and how many are at alert level 3? I can't give exact numbers, but I can say if you take alert level 3, we extended the workers who return from collieries that supply Eskom and refineries, and the production at reduced capacity for other mines. At level 4, we extended that to say all open casts must be at full production at level 4. I can estimate that to be 2/3 of the workforce in the mining industry. And then the 1/3 will be at level 3 when you ramp up production in deep mining. Mining is employing over 400,000 workers. So it's quite a big number of workers. So exact number, how many were there at that level, we can't give that. Did the mining not open too soon and too aggressively? Actually, one time when we were discussing this thing of opening mining, there was an argument that why should we open mining? We pointed to everybody in government that, listen, if you don't open mining, you are going to be hiding the extent of COVID-19 because there's a concentration of workers in mines, and that is a regulated area. So a regulated space is better to test and screen than people who disappear in villages. You know, one time we had workers coming back to a Podla mine in Tubatse Valley, and in that case we discovered 19 cases in one set of testing. When we did that testing, we discovered that 3 of those workers were from Mozambique, 2 were from the Eastern Cape, 1 was from Zimbabwe, meaning that the result of the matter is that the concentration is not necessarily in the mines. It's people who are all over the country who are coming together now to the place of work. And the reason that we said there must be screening and testing, we insisted on that, was that we wanted to discover the cases that are positive in the industry. If we don't do that, we're going to have a disaster of just discovering a big amount of workers. You know, Mponeng tested over 600 workers, and 1/3 of those workers tested positive because people escaped the screening and testing and went underground. That's where they come to a situation where there's a concentration of a big number of workers. So 1/3 of those workers tested positive. So in my view, we didn't open too quick, we didn't open too aggressively. We should have opened earlier and allow mines to be tested, because if we don't test them, we'll not discover positive cases. You can only discover positive cases when you test.
Thank you, Minister Mantashe. Minister Nxesi.
Let me start by adding on the previous questions about these notices which are given to the employers. First is that the notices are based on the conditions and level of compliance by the employers. There are instances where we see gross non-compliance. Hence, we go for closure. There are instances where the company is given a notice or a warning to improve a number of things. But in all those instances, companies have a right to appeal. They can appeal to the chief inspector if they feel that they have not been handled fairly. And we have activated the processes within that unit of inspectorate that they deal with all these on a fast-track basis. So they still have a right to raise queries about the processes. And we want to emphasize that they must not run to courts. They must use the dispute resolving mechanisms which we have inside. I thought that I must emphasize that. The second issue is, my apologies, Vuyo. I think I've said we are currently processing the April queries. And as soon as those are resolved, the workers will be paid. Even if we have started with the tranches of May, those monies will be paid because they are legitimate. So it's important that we have that particular understanding. So as we are speaking, the April queries and those applications are being addressed as we speak, and we're talking about the queries, which might not be many. There were queries, for instance, in relation to the foreign workers or workers who are coming from outside South Africa in the mining industry. Last week we were dealing with all those queries. And all it takes is for the employers to give us a confirmation about those workers who might not be having the South African ID. So we are dealing with those issues. We're not going to close if those applications are legitimate. The question from Mercedes Percent about inundated calls in relation to the issues of self-quarantine. When the workers have to do that, they get the threats and intimidation and be told that they can be expelled. I think we must give a notice to the employers who are behaving like that. We will be lodging disputes on behalf of those workers. We will do that against those employers once we get the detailed information. It's becoming very clear to us that the new inspectors who are to appoint will have to flood the Western Cape because we are faced with a huge problem in the Western Cape. But it's not surprising given the national statistics and the trends in the Western Cape that there are serious problems in that province, even if at some stage it's going to go into the other provinces. But the employers need to understand one thing. It's not just about disputes or challenges. Sometimes we can lay criminal charges against those employers who are forcing the workers to do wrong things. Once the workers have been infected, we can be able to do that, depending on the merits of that particular. So it's criminal what they will be doing to violate the law and expose the workers into such dangers. So they need to understand that. So we can be able to act on behalf of those workers who are unorganized, whilst the unions will be able to work on behalf of their own their own employees. Sidwell talks about the direct applications. The application have always been done by the employers, and we have been paying the employers. But realizing that some of the employers were resisting, were not applying for the workers, we have now said we're opening for the workers to do it directly. These are some of the queries which we are dealing with. And as we go into the next stage, the employers would still apply, but we will be paying now directly to the workers as much as the employers have applied, because it leads to a lot of disputes. Some of the workers feel that they've been shortchanged. We've discussed this matter at NEDLAC, and we have agreed that let's pay directly to those workers. But still, the employers must do the applications. But some of the workers we are going to be dealing with. That's why I was talking about, with the reopening of our labor centers, we expect huge numbers of the workers who will be coming to come and raise their disputes, their queries. And some of them are even saying, we have seen from what we have published in your website that our company has been paid, but it has not given us money. So these are all the issues which we will be dealing with. I'm not sure if,
Are you then saying, Minister, the workers can then come to the labor centers to lodge complaints and even applications?
Yes.
The question was, how can they apply?
One of the issues, the reason why we're insisting on these electronic applications is because our labor centers were closed, and only a few opened in the UIF offices who were doing the processing and so on. But now, as we are opening, it's going to give a chance those who do not have the necessary technology to come directly on their own, to deal with the applications, to deal with the queries. But even there, we also have to be very careful and readapt our offices, the social distancing arrangement and so on, because they are going to come. And if you look into our statements, we've been talking about the 1st of June. But what is very clear, there's a lot of work which we'll have to do in readapting that. Hence, we are saying those offices might be full-blown working as from the 8th, but we are starting on the 1st of June. Some of them might be ready before that, but would need a few days to be able to do this particular redesign of our own offices.
Thank you. Minister Patel.
Thank you. Let me start with the question by Mercedes Percent on the COVID compliance officers, whether they need to be on-site or can they be virtual. The regulations don't specifically state where the compliance officers need to be located. And they need to do a number of things. They must ensure that a plan that has been developed for the workplace is actually implemented, and that there's adherence to the standards of hygiene and health protocols in that workplace. They need to ensure that there is a phased return of workers, that everybody don't arrive on Monday morning at the factory gates and stand outside in large numbers and provide opportunities for infections to spread. In that plan, it must look at which employees are required back at work. What about those ones that need to be available to work off-site? In every workplace plan, the full details, the name and details of the compliance officer must be set out. And the regulations go further, and they say that the designation, the compliance officer must ensure that safety controls are strictly adhered to, and that the name of that compliance officer in the case of retail must be displayed in the store itself. So when you come into the supermarket, the name of the compliance officer is there, because that's the person that's accountable. So practically speaking, compliance officers would have to be on site to be able to make this work and to carry out the responsibilities that is placed on them. On the question by Nelly from News 24, and her questions related to the sale of liquor, when will directions be released and what will they cover? I should point out, Nelly, that it's not a requirement in the regulations that there must be directions. It says the sale of liquor may be subject to directions issued by the relevant cabinet member. The government has received the proposals from the industry, how they can deal with managing the reopening of stores and facilities, social distancing, how to address concerns around binge drinking and so on. We are evaluating those, and if it becomes necessary to put a direction in place, of course we will do so. If these are, and a big part of level 3 is about companies, firms, managers taking responsibility, because in level 5 and 4 there were tight, very, very detailed regulations. In level 3 it is a shift of responsibility to the workplace to take care of the protocols and the social distancing that's needed. Nazir of Glow TV raised the question of inflated prices, and he asks the question, can action be taken against private individuals? The national consumer legislation applies not just to firms but also to any juristic person, basically. So in other words, it would ensure that we are able to investigate and get to the bottom of these matters. I'm just looking for the toll-free number. So natural persons are also covered. So if you import a large quantity of goods and you sell it as an individual, you would still be covered by the consumer legislation. The National Consumer Commission has a toll-free number. It's 08000 14 880. 08000 14 880. And I would encourage Nazir and the listeners to provide that information. Of course, the two regulators are very busy investigating. Each case takes a bit of time to get to the details. They've got to get the information before deciding if there's a case to be answered. And so we would ask that the public bear with us. But as Commissioner Bonakele has said, there is a definite awareness in the market that the regulators will act. And even if they don't act this week or last week, they are collecting information and evidence, and prosecution can follow at any stage. So it's really a call on individuals and firms to act with enormous restraint. Even government has been inundated with people who have been texting and phoning and saying, we've got personal protective equipment, and when we investigate the prices, they are enormous, very, very high prices, enormous margins that people have put into some of these. Not everybody does it, but there's been a number of cases like that. And then government has declined to pay those absolutely inflated prices. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister Didi?
Thank you, Minister Ntembu. As of yesterday, the updated figures have is that we have activated 66 private sites with just over 9,000 beds. We activated 72 public sites with just over 3,600 beds. Rate in the private sector that are negotiated by National Treasury, it range between 850 to 1,200 rand per bed per night. In the public sector, the cost is borne by government and by the provincial department, providing bedding and food and any other assistance. The number of people in quarantine fluctuates on a daily basis because some people leave after 14 days, then other people will come in. But the number of people in quarantine is always provided by the Department of Health. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much, Minister Dilil and my colleagues, Minister Mantashe, Minister Messi, Minister Patel. Do we have questions?
No, Minister, we don't have questions.
Thank you. Now, I know that I don't know why the media likes that WhatsApp number. Nanga, let's take your last 5.
Actually, I only have it's the last 2. Actually.
Oh, that's much better.
Yes. John Fraser is asking Minister Patel to please name the 3 chosen ventilator manufacturers. And there's a question from Alan, again for Minister Mantashe. If there is time and space, could you please give more details on the thinking around companies accessing rehabilitation funds, and what is the thinking around how this will be used when rules around this, when rules around the use of this money are extremely rigorous about withdrawals? What will be the circumstances when this will be allowed, and is there a maximum percentage of funds that can be drawn? And Naziresh just asked the Minister to respond to the question around the negotiations for possible opening of hair salons on Monday. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe I think that question has been asked, the one of hair salons. I don't know who wants to start with that one. It was asked quite some time ago, and I know that we've been ducking and diving. And okay, but
it's not I mean, just to be serious, because obviously these are businesses employing people, and one recognizes the hardship those businesses are going through. But the challenge we face in all of this is making sure that South Africans are safe is a joint initiative, really, that government has a role to play, citizens, businesses, all of us. And it's working bit by bit, step by step through the different sectors. We've now spent the period since the level 4 working on those areas that can be opened safely or reasonably safely in level 3. And we're now working with those companies to embed various protocols and social distancing arrangements. There are a smaller number of economic activities that have not opened yet. In the regulations, we've specifically provided that when we have finalized arrangements for the safe opening of those additional businesses, then those can be put into effect. We haven't yet. It still requires some further discussion. It's not something that can just be done overnight, because there are risks. I mean, we've seen now as companies and industries reopen, even the ones where workers don't have to work in physical contact with each other, there has been an increase in infections. And at some stage, this translates to more South Africans dying. And so it's a very serious and a very critical issue that we need to work cautiously and carefully on. And for this reason, we will be reaching out to these sectors. Most of our attention has now been to sectors where people don't have to have this physical contact, but in the cutting and hair and so on, there is no way in which it can be done without the person coming into direct contact with the client or the consumer. So there are additional measures that may be necessary, and these will have to be looked at. Right now, our main focus has been on getting those businesses where there isn't that physical contact to the point where they can open, And I think the focus will thereafter go to these other areas. I thought I should just make this point because sometimes the light-hearted remarks that one has to make is interpreted as if government is not concerned about it. We are obviously quite concerned. If I may just take the opportunity, colleague, on the naming of the ventilator companies. John, I'm not even sure if the companies themselves have been officially informed, so it would be something that we just have to wait for that process. I know we're all eager to hear it, but once we've gone through those processes, and in government, the reason why these processes have to be followed is so that the decisions are sound decisions, that all the checks and balances have been put in place, and that the official announcements can be made. Sometimes it's frustrating. Please understand, bear with us, but we are keen to make the story a very positive story, to take journalists and others to the factories, of course, maintaining social distance when the production starts. Thank you very much.
Mr. Gnese?
On your question, God, I can make the last comment.
Yenze that.
No, I want to appeal to all the employers that only a healthy workforce can boost business. The well-being of the employees should be taken very, very seriously. And I'm appealing, we don't need to go to these disputes of courts if we can be able to put the necessary structures. And again, we will be coming for an update about our offices because they will be ready at the different times. Some might be ready earlier in the week, some late, but up to the 8th. Thank you.
Mr. Mantashe?
Rehabilitation funds are ring-fence funds for a specific purpose. So it's not free money that is available. But what we have said we should do is that in the effort to reignite the economy, we must use the interest earned by those funds for projects that will ignite economic activity. So every project will be assessed on its merit. I must also expand that because there have been attempts to take money for social labor plan and want to redirect it to pay wages and do that. We have refused because social labor plan money is not our money. It is commitment by the companies to develop communities. So that money belongs to communities. Nobody must just grab that money and do anything. So people will come to us on the question of the interest earned from rehabilitation funds if a project is to reignite economic activity and absorb some of the workers who are actually going to get retrenched in the process of companies becoming smaller. Let me give you this last comment, Baumte, that companies must accept that our regional inspectors, in addition to labor and employment inspectors, will visit them as regularly as they do. It's not intended to trick them. We want to ensure that there is compliance and companies must comply. And any mine that try to hide COVID-19 cases is actually bordering on treason.
Yeah.
Because when you do that and you take a COVID-19 case, you want to register as a private case, you are a threat to the industry. Because we'll discover that and the industry will be facing harsh penalties for that case. So, and lastly, I want to appeal to union activists and shopkeepers to appreciate that they have a big role in ensuring that we save lives and we make the industry stronger. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, colleagues. By the way, yesterday we had a briefing by the Minister of COGTA on the regulations that will kick in level 3 of the lockdown. After the regulations were publicized and made public, we had the JCPS cluster, Minister Bheki Cele, Minister Aaron Motsoaledi, Minister Maphisa Nqakula also coming here to say what it is that as the cluster they are going to do under level 3. We now have had the economic cluster speaking to us on what are we going to do to continue our efforts to combat the spread of COVID-19. Tomorrow at 10, same venue, we are having the Minister of Arts, Culture and Sport, Minister Nathi Mthethwa, speaking to what are we going to do in that sector. At 2 o'clock, again, the reason why Minister Mbalula is not here is because he's also consulting with the industry, the transport industry. At 2 o'clock tomorrow, Minister Mbalula will be here to also indicate how are we going to deal with the movement of people through public transport, your buses, your trains, your taxis during level 3. Again, the reason not here again is because, like I've said, he's consulting with the industry. Similarly, the issues that Minister Patel has raised on the cutting of hair and the attendance to our hair, the Minister of Tourism is, as we speak now, in consultation with the sector. That's why she will also be speaking on those issues tomorrow evening at 18 hours. We are a consultative government. Whatever else that we do, even on the lockdowns, as you will know, we consulted society, we consulted business. As we started the lockdown, we consulted labor, we consulted community organizations. This is in our DNA. That's what we do. We are consultative in nature. Therefore, having said that, all these measures that we have put in place are an outcome of consultation. Social distancing, washing our hands, including consultation with experts in the health fraternity, people who advise the Minister of Health, including the wearing of masks, all these things which we have now made part of our health regime are matters that we have consulted fully with the South African community. We are therefore saying, when we say to our people and the people in our country that it is now in your hands, is because we have done everything we have to do at the level of government. We have put in protocols, we have put in health measures that needs to be adhered to. But indeed, at the end of the day, it is now up to all of us. It's up to all of us. That's why we say in our slogan, stay safe, protect South Africa. It is up to us now. It is now in our hands to protect not only ourselves, our families, our loved ones, and indeed our communities and people that we work with in our workspaces. So all those who are saying that when we say it is in our hands, we are making a mistake, we don't think so. We think we are correct because it is now expected of all of us to adhere to all these measures that government has put in place. Of course, government can't police 57 million South Africans. It's up to us, it is in our hands to adhere to these measures. We'll want to repeat it once again. It is now in our hands. Government has done everything in its power to bring in protocols, to bring in regulations, to bring in all the things that are needed and the framework of things that are needed for us to remain safe under the COVID environment. But if we don't follow those as individuals, we can't then turn around and say that government has not played its part. government has played its part. Let me repeat what the President said. It is now in our hands. Thank you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, bro. I was worried that the court would be that we're ducking and diving, so I just jumped in there.
I meant taking it. That's why I didn't want to go back to it. I mean here, because it has been asked quite some time ago.
I think I will feel
Yeah, the question, so we
Yeah.
So, but it was made in high touch.
Yeah, I know.
But it's good that you answered.
Because then they quote those kind of things in court. Yeah, the other thing is,